A seat isn't just a piece of furniture in the sky. In the rarefied air of first class, 30,000 feet above the world, it's a symbol of status, achievement, and respect. But what happens when that seat becomes a battlefield? For Julian Sinclair, a titan of industry on the cusp of a billion-dollar deal, his seat 1A was simply a place to rest. But when the lead flight attendant demanded he surrender it for a white passenger, that seat became a war zone. They saw his skin, not his stature. They saw a target, not a titan. Buckle up, Dark Stories fans, because this is a tale of prejudice, power, and jaw-dropping karma you won't believe. The cabin of Stellara Air's flagship A380, Flight 815, from New York to Zurich, was less an airplane interior and more a monument to opulence. It was a world unto itself, a gilded cage designed to insulate its occupants from the mundane realities of travel. Each of the 12 suites in the VIP first-class section was a private cocoon of cream-colored leather, polished burled walnut, and brushed chrome. The air itself seemed different here, infused with the subtle, expensive scent of neroli, and the quiet hum of possibility. In Suite 1A sat Julian Sinclair. At 42, he possessed a stillness that was often mistaken for aloofness. It was, in fact, the deep calm of a man who had wrestled chaos to the ground and won time and time again. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, no tie, and a crisp white shirt, he looked less like a passenger and more like he was sculpted from the very ambition that powered the city he just left behind. His dark skin seemed to absorb the soft cabin light, and his eyes, focused on a set of architectural blueprints on his tablet, held the quiet intensity of a master strategist. Julian was the founder and CEO of Aura Innovations, a company that had single-handedly revolutionized renewable energy storage. He hadn't inherited a fortune. He had built one from intellect, grit, and an unnerving ability to see 5 moves ahead of everyone else. This trip to Zurich was the culmination of a 2-year negotiation, a merger with the Swiss tech giant Helvetia Dynamics. It was a legacy deal, the kind that would not only make him a billionaire several times over but would also fundamentally change the global energy landscape. He needed to be rested, sharp, and focused. Stellara Air, with its reputation for impeccable service, was supposed to be a seamless part of that equation. But, Dark Stories viewers, what happens when the system fails spectacularly? Stay tuned, because this injustice is about to spark a revolution. He had barely registered the last passenger boarding. The pre-departure champagne, a crisp Dom Perignon 2012, had been served, and the gentle rhythm of the crew's final preparations was a familiar lullaby of luxury travel. The soft click of a closing overhead bin. The rustle of a magazine. The low murmur of another passenger talking to the attendant. It was all background noise until the noise came to him. "Excuse me. I believe you're in my seat." The voice was sharp, cutting through the cabin's serene atmosphere like a shard of glass. It was drenched in an accent that spoke of old money, boarding schools, and a lifetime of unquestioned privilege. Julian looked up slowly, his focus shifting from the complex schematics on his screen. Before him stood a man in his late 50s with a florid complexion that clashed with his pale blonde hair. He was dressed in a tweed jacket that seemed too warm for the cabin, a garish gold signet ring flashing on his pinky finger as he gestured impatiently toward the seat number. This was a Leicester Finch. Julian offered a neutral, polite smile. "I believe you'll find this is 1A, he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "And my boarding pass confirms it." Finch scoffed, a dismissive little puff of air. "There must be a mistake. I am always in 1A. My assistant at Whitman Price and Sterling is meticulous. She books my travel a year in advance." He said the name of the prestigious law firm as if it were a royal title that granted him dominion over all airline seating. Julian didn't flinch. He simply held up his phone, displaying the digital boarding pass with Sinclair J, Seat 1A in clear, bold letters. "No mistake on my end, I'm afraid." Finch's face tightened, the florid color deepening to a blotchy crimson. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by a black man who had the audacity to occupy his space without apology. He didn't even look at the phone. Instead, he flagged down the nearest flight attendant with a sharp, imperious snap of his fingers. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Brenda Walsh, hurried over. She was in her late 40s with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a smile that was permanently lacquered onto her face, though it didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. She had been with Stellara Air for 2 decades and carried herself with the air of a drill sergeant in a designer uniform. "Yes, Mr. Finch." "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice oozing a practiced deference. She knew him from previous flights. He was a Diamond Medallion Premier Guest, a designation that in her world placed him just below deity status. "This man," Finch huffed, jutting his chin toward Julian, "is in my seat." "Handle it." Brenda's professional smile flickered for a nanosecond as she turned to Julian. The deference vanished, replaced by a brisk, condescending efficiency. The calculation in her eyes was swift and brutal. On one hand, a known wealthy white frequent flyer. On the other, a black man she didn't recognize, who, despite his expensive suit, must be the source of the error. "Sir," she began, her tone the one a teacher might use for a child who has colored outside the lines. "I'm sure this is just a simple mix-up. May I see your boarding pass?" Julian, maintaining his unnerving calm, showed her the screen. "As I showed this gentleman, it's correct. Seat 1A. Brenda glanced at it, but her mind was already made up. "Our system can sometimes have glitches during check-in. Mr. Finch is a valued client who is always accommodated in this particular suite. It's possible you were reassigned at the gate." "I wasn't," Julian stated simply. "I checked in online yesterday. I chose this seat. There have been no notifications of a change." A younger flight attendant, Chloe, a woman in her early 20s with wide, earnest eyes, lingered nearby, rearranging napkins. She could feel the tension ratcheting up and instinctively knew something was wrong. She saw Julian's boarding pass clearly. It was valid. She saw Finch's entitled posture and Brenda's immediate fawning response. Finch, growing more agitated, chimed in. "Look, I don't have time for this. My flight to Geneva connects in Zurich. I need to get settled." Brenda turned her full attention back to Julian, her smile now gone completely. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move. We have a lovely seat for you in 4B. It wasn't a request. It was an order." And the implication was clear. Despite the evidence, despite the digital proof, his claim to this space was being invalidated in favor of the man who felt he belonged there more. Julian looked at Brenda, then at Finch, and he saw it all laid bare. A lifetime of microaggressions distilled into one ugly, defining moment. They weren't just asking him to move seats. They were telling him he didn't belong in the front. His calm, however, did not break. It hardened. "No," Julian said, the single word landing with the weight of a dropped anchor. "I'm in the seat assigned to me on my purchase ticket. I won't be moving." The cabin, once a haven of quiet luxury, was now silent and electric. The other passengers, titans of finance and industry themselves, were now watching. The gilded cage had become a stage, and Brenda Walsh, having made her decision, was about to double down on the worst mistake of her career. Brenda Walsh was not accustomed to being told no, especially not by a passenger she had already mentally categorized as being in the wrong. To her, the hierarchy was simple. The airline's most loyal, high-revenue customers came first. Mr. Finch was a known quantity of wealth. Julian Sinclair was an unknown variable, and in the risk-averse world of customer service, variables were to be eliminated. Julian's refusal, calm and absolute, was a direct challenge to her authority. The lacquered smile was now a thin, hard line. "Sir, please don't make this difficult," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its customer service sweetness and gaining a steely edge. "We need to finish boarding and prepare for an on-time departure. I'm sure you don't want to be the cause of a delay for everyone on this flight." It was a classic tactic, weaponizing the collective against the individual. She was painting him as the problem, the obstructionist. Alistair Finch, emboldened by Brenda's support, took a step closer. "Just get up and move, for God's sake. What's the problem? A seat is a seat." "If a seat is just a seat," Julian replied, his eyes still locked on Brenda, completely ignoring Finch, then you will have no objection to taking the one available in 4B. My business is in Zurich. Your connection is in Zurich. We will both arrive at the same time. The logic was irrefutable, and that only seemed to infuriate Finch and Brenda more. This wasn't about logic. It was about status and an unspoken code of who gets to demand and who is expected to yield. That's not the point, Brenda snapped. The point is that I, as the lead purser on this flight, am instructing you to relocate. It's my job to resolve seating discrepancies. Then resolve it by honoring my ticket, Julian countered, his voice still maddeningly level. You've seen my boarding pass. It is correct. You have not shown me any documentation that suggests otherwise. You are not resolving a discrepancy. You are creating one based on a passenger's preference. Chloe, the junior attendant, edged forward slightly. Brenda, she whispered, her voice barely audible. His pass is valid. I saw it. Maybe I can check the manifest on the tablet. Perhaps Mr. Finch's booking. Brenda shot her a look that could curdle cream. Stay out of this, Chloe. I know how to handle this. She turned back to Julian, her patience completely gone. Sir, I've had just about enough of this. We have procedures for non-compliant passengers. If you do not vacate the seat immediately, I will be forced to call the captain. The word non-compliant hung in the air, a deliberate escalation. It was the language used for unruly, often drunk or aggressive passengers. To apply it to a man sitting calmly in his assigned seat was a gross and intentional mischaracterization of the situation. Then you should call the captain, Julian said, leaning back slightly in his seat, a subtle gesture that indicated he was not just staying put, but settling in. Perhaps he can explain to me the Stellara Air policy of invalidating a paid, confirmed ticket based on another passenger's tantrum. The other passengers were now openly staring. A woman in 2C, a well-known tech investor named Cassandra Thorne, no relation to the captain, slowly lowered her newspaper, her brow furrowed with disapproval at the scene. An older gentleman in 3A shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable," to his wife. The atmosphere was thick with second-hand embarrassment and a growing sense of injustice. Finch, seeing his victory slipping away, played his final card. This is outrageous. I'm a million-mile flyer with this airline. I pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to this company. And I am being treated this way? I want his name. I'll have his job. He pointed a trembling, sausage-like finger at Julian, his face a mask of pure fury. The irony of his threat was lost on him. Brenda, flustered and desperate to placate Finch, spoke into her wrist communicator. Brenda to flight deck. Captain Thorne, I need you in the first-class cabin immediately. We have a passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions. A few minutes later, Captain Richard Thorne emerged from the cockpit. He was a man who looked the part, tall, silver-haired, with a square jaw and an air of unflappable authority. He had flown for 30 years and had seen it all, or so he thought. He approached the scene with a mind already biased by his lead attendant's report, a non-compliant passenger. What's the trouble here? He asked, his voice a commanding rumble that was used to being obeyed without question. Brenda launched into a one-sided, breathless summary. Captain, I've explained to this gentleman that there appears to be a seating duplication. Mr. Finch, one of our most valued premier guests, is assigned to this seat. I have repeatedly asked this person to move to another suite, and he is refusing, delaying our departure. Captain Thorne looked at Julian, his gaze clinical and impatient. He didn't ask for Julian's side of the story. He didn't ask to see his boarding pass. He trusted his lead purser. That was his job. That was his mistake. Son, the captain said, the word dripping with condescension, you heard the purser. We don't have time for games. We have a schedule to keep. Now, either you take the other seat willingly, or I'll have you and your bags removed from my aircraft. It's your choice. The threat was absolute. The united front of the crew was impenetrable. Julian Sinclair looked at the captain's stern face, at Brenda's triumphant sneer, and at Finch's smug, expectant smirk. He saw a system that was not designed to find the truth, but to enforce a predetermined order. He held their gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching out. The entire cabin held its breath. They expected him to argue, to protest, to finally break his composure and show anger. He did none of those things. Instead, a profound shift occurred in his demeanor. The defensive calm was replaced by something else entirely, a quiet, chilling resolution. It was the look of a king who had just been advised to abdicate his throne by a court jester. Slowly, deliberately, Julian Sinclair began to gather his things. He unplugged his tablet and slid it carefully into his leather briefcase. He took one last small sip of the champagne. He stood up, adjusting the lie of his suit jacket. Finch let out a triumphant hum and made to slide into the seat, but Julian didn't move toward 4B. He turned and faced Captain Thorne. "You're right, Captain," he said, his voice devoid of any anger, holding only a strange, cold clarity. "It is my choice." He looked past the captain, his eyes finding Chloe's. He gave her a very slight, almost imperceptible nod of what? Acknowledgement? Reassurance? Then he turned and began to walk toward the open door of the aircraft. "Wait, where are you going?" Brenda called out, confused. "Your other seat is this way." Julian paused at the threshold of the jet bridge, turning back to look at the assembled crew. "I find the service on this flight to be unsatisfactory," he said. "I've decided to deplane." And with that, he stepped out of the aircraft. Alistair Finch laughed aloud, a short, barking sound of victory. Brenda and Captain Thorne exchanged a look of weary relief. The problem had removed itself. They could finally get on with their flight. On the jet bridge, Julian pulled out his phone. He didn't call his assistant to rebook. He didn't call the airline's customer service to complain. He scrolled through his contacts to a name at the very top of his list, a direct line he had never used before. The name on the screen read, Sir Gideon Drake, chairman of the board, Stellara Global Holdings. He pressed the call button. "Gideon," Julian said, his voice calm as he watched the ground crew through the window. "It's Julian Sinclair. We have a problem with one of our assets. Flight 815 at JFK. A beat of silence. "No, the plane is fine," Julian continued. "The crew, however, is a different story. Ground them. Ground the flight immediately." Back inside the A380, a sense of smug relief settled over the crew. The disruption was over. Alistair Finch had triumphantly settled into seat 1A, already demanding another glass of champagne from Chloe, which she delivered with a trembling hand and downcast eyes. Brenda Walsh was supervising the final cabin checks with renewed vigor, her authority successfully asserted. Captain Thorne had retreated to the cockpit, eager to make up for the lost time. From their perspective, a minor inconvenience had been professionally handled. "See," Brenda said quietly to Chloe, straightening a stack of menus with a sharp snap. "That's how you handle difficult passengers. Firm, fair, and fast." Chloe murmured a noncommittal, "Yes, Brenda." But her stomach was in knots. She knew what she had witnessed wasn't fair. It was a humiliation. She had seen Julian Sinclair's face as he'd left, not angry, but something far more unsettling. It was a look of profound disappointment, followed by an unnerving resolve. Less than 5 minutes had passed since Julian had stepped onto the jet bridge. The main cabin door was still open, waiting for the final paperwork from the gate agent. The engines were whining, ready to spool up for pushback. Everything was proceeding as normal. Then the captain's voice crackled over the cabin intercom, sharp and laced with a sudden, jarring urgency. "Brenda, report to the flight deck now." The tone was so different from his usual calm command that it sent a ripple of alarm through the cabin. Brenda, her triumphant mood instantly evaporating, hurried toward the cockpit. The other passengers, who had been settling back into their pre-flight routines, looked up, sensing a new chapter in the drama was about to unfold. Brenda slipped into the cockpit, closing the door behind her. Captain Thorne was in his seat, his headset askew. The first officer was staring at his console, his face pale. The captain wasn't looking at his instruments. He was staring at the cockpit door, his expression one of utter disbelief. "What is it, Richard?" Gate agent issues? Brenda asked. Captain Thorne swiveled his chair to face her. The confident, authoritative man from a few minutes ago was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had just been struck by lightning. I just got a call, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. On the sat phone, it was patched through from the Stellara Global Operations Center in London. But the call, it came from the chairman. Brenda's blood ran cold. Sir Gideon Drake, the chairman of the entire parent corporation. He was a near-mythical figure, a titan who never involved himself in the day-to-day operations of a single flight. Why would he call us? He asked me to confirm my flight number, the captain continued, his voice trembling slightly. He asked me to confirm my name. Then he asked me a very specific question. Thorne paused, swallowing hard. He asked me, Captain, could you please describe the passenger you just ejected from seat 1A? Brenda's mind raced. Ejected? We didn't eject him. He chose to deplane. That is not how the chairman sees it, Thorne's voice rose, cracking with stress. I described the man, black, well-dressed, calm, and then there was silence on the line, just for a second. Then Sir Gideon said. The captain looked at Brenda, his eyes wide with dawning horror. He said, Richard, you have just kicked the owner of this airline off his own plane. The words hung in the sterile air of the cockpit, seeming to suck all the oxygen out with them. Brenda felt a wave of dizziness. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A joke. A mistake. Owner? What are you talking about? Stellara Air is publicly traded, owned by Stellara Global Holdings. And as of 3 months ago, the captain interrupted, his voice hollow, a controlling interest in Stellara Global Holdings was acquired by a private equity firm, a firm named Aura Capital. Aura. The name echoed in Brenda's mind. She remembered the subtle, elegant logo on the man's briefcase. Aura Innovations, Aura Capital. It slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The quiet, non-compliant passenger in 1A wasn't just some successful tech guy. He was the guy. The one at the very top of the food chain he had so diligently worked. There's more, Captain Thorne said, his face ashen. Sir Gideon informed me that Mr. Sinclair's acquisition was a quiet one. He's been assessing the company's assets and operations personally, flying on different routes, observing. He wanted an unvarnished view of his new company before the public announcement next month. Oh my God, Brenda breathed, slumping against the cockpit wall. He got one, all right, the captain said bitterly. He got a front row seat to his own staff's bigotry and incompetence. Sir Gideon was explicit. His instructions were very clear. He looked up at Brenda, and now there was no camaraderie, no shared relief. There was only raw, unadulterated panic and the dawning reality of their shared ruin. Mr. Sinclair has grounded the flight indefinitely. Grounded? We can't be grounded. We have 300 other passengers. They don't care about the other passengers right now, Brenda. They care about the fact that the man who signs all of our paychecks was just humiliated by his own employees. The captain took a deep, shaky breath. The order stands. This plane is not moving. And that's not all. He paused, the final words catching in his throat. We are to be met at the gate by airline security and management. Our credentials are to be revoked. We are to be escorted from the premises. He looked Brenda straight in the eye, the full weight of the catastrophe finally landing. Brenda, we are fired. All of us, me, the first officer, you, the entire cabin crew, effective immediately. Brenda stared at him, speechless. Fired. Not suspended. Not reprimanded. Fired on the spot. 20 years of service, of building her little fiefdom in the sky, gone evaporated in 5 minutes because of a snap judgment. A prejudice she had allowed to guide her actions. From outside the cockpit door, the calm of the cabin was shattered by the authoritative voice of a gate supervisor speaking into the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. The captain has informed us that Flight 815 is now cancelled due to an unforeseen operational issue. Please gather your belongings and prepare to deplane. A wave of groans and confused chatter erupted from the passengers. Alistair Finch in seat 1 looked around in fury, robbed of his triumphant departure. Cancelled? What in God's name is going on? He bellowed to no one in particular. For Brenda Walsh and Captain Richard Thorne, trapped in the sudden silence of the cockpit, the answer was terrifyingly clear. The entire crew had been fired, and their world was coming crashing down around them. The deplaning of a cancelled international flight is an orderly chaos, a slow-moving river of frustration. But for the crew of Flight 815, it was a walk of shame. As the last passenger shuffled off the jet bridge, two stern-faced Stellara airground managers and a uniformed security detail stepped onto the aircraft. They didn't speak to the crew as colleagues. They addressed them as subjects of an internal investigation. Captain Thorne, Purser Walsh, please hand over your company IDs and all flight credentials, the senior manager, a man named Peterson, said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He had received his orders directly from the Vice President of Operations, who had in turn received them from a very panicked CEO, who had just gotten off the phone with an apoplectic Sir Gideon Drake. The command had cascaded down the corporate ladder with the speed and force of a tsunami. Captain Thorne and Brenda Walsh complied in stunned silence, their hands trembling as they unclipped their IDs. The rest of the crew, including Chloe, were rounded up in the galley and given the same instruction. They were herded together like prisoners, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning comprehension. As they were escorted through the terminal, past their former passengers, who were now crowding the gate desk, demanding answers, the humiliation was absolute. They were professionals one moment, pariahs the next. Brenda saw Chloe's tear-streaked face and felt a pang of something, guilt, perhaps, but it was quickly swallowed by her own searing anger and self-pity. The news broke with astonishing speed. It didn't start with a press release from Stellara Air. It started on social media. Cassandra Thorne, the tech investor from Seat2C, had live-tweeted the entire incident. Absolutely stunning display of corporate self-destruction on at Stellara Air Flight 815. Watch the crew, led by a purser named Brenda, bully a calm, polite black gentleman out of his paid won a seat for an obnoxious white man. The captain backed his crew without even listening. The gentleman simply deplaned. 5 minutes later, flight cancelled. Rumor spreading through the cabin is the man they kicked off owns the airline. You can't make this up. #Stellara Air Meltdown. By the time the fired crew had been processed and unceremoniously dumped on the curb outside JFK, the hashtag was trending worldwide. News vans were already on their way to the airport. The story was irresistible, a tale of poetic justice, of instant, brutal karma. The karma, however, was just beginning its cascade. For Alistair Finch, he was initially furious about the cancellation, storming the customer service desk and demanding compensation, a private jet, and the personal phone number of the CEO. He loudly blamed the disruptive passenger who had caused all the trouble. His tune changed when his phone began to vibrate incessantly. A junior associate from his law firm, Whitman Price and Sterling, was on the line, his voice panicked. "Alistair, what did you do? The firm is trending on Twitter. There's a video." Someone, likely another passenger, had filmed part of the confrontation. The video showed Finch, red-faced and sputtering, demanding Julian move. It showed his entitled arrogance in stark, unforgiving detail. For a prestigious law firm that had just spent millions on a new diversity and inclusion campaign, the footage was a public relations hydrogen bomb. By the end of the day, Alistair Finch was suspended. By the end of the week, the board of partners, facing a client exodus and a firestorm of negative press, demanded his resignation. His meticulous assistant was quietly let go. The old money and connections he had wielded as a weapon were useless against the swift, brutal court of public opinion, and the new power structure he had unwittingly challenged. He lost his job, his reputation, and the status he held so dear. All for a seat he never should have had. For Brenda Walsh, she became the face of the incident. Her name was everywhere. She tried to defend herself in a disastrous interview with a tabloid news site, claiming she was following procedure and that the situation was handled professionally. She blamed Julian for being uncooperative and the airline for not supporting its staff. The backlash was immediate. Former colleagues and passengers came forward with stories of her past behavior, a pattern of deferring to wealthy white men while treating other passengers with disdain. Stellara Air, in full damage control mode, released a statement condemning her actions and terminated her pension plan, citing a gross violation of the company's code of conduct. Blacklisted by the commercial airline industry and a pariah online, the career she had spent 2 decades building was not just over, it was radioactive. For Captain Richard Thorne, his fall was perhaps the most tragic. He was a man who prided himself on procedure and command. But his critical failure was one of judgment. He hadn't investigated. He had merely enforced his subordinates' biased will. In the aviation world, where a captain's judgment is paramount, this was an unforgivable sin. The FAA opened an inquiry into his handling of the incident. His license was suspended. The career he loved, the sky that had been his office, was now close to him forever. He was a captain with no ship, a commander with no command. For Stellara Air, the financial and logistical fallout was catastrophic. The grounding of one A380 created a domino effect, canceling and delaying flights across their Atlantic routes for days. The stock of Stellara Global Holdings plummeted 18% in the first 24 hours, wiping out over $2 billion in market value, a staggering price for a single act of prejudice. The hashtag Stellara Air meltdown became a case study in business schools on how not to handle customer service. Amidst the chaos, only one person seemed to be thriving. Chloe, the junior attendant, was contacted by Julian Sinclair's new interim management team. They had been told by Julian himself that she had attempted to intervene and de-escalate. She was offered a position not as a flight attendant, but as part of a new task force being assembled to overhaul the company's entire customer service and sensitivity training program from the ground up. She was the only one who had shown integrity. And now she was being given the chance to rebuild the very system that had failed so spectacularly. The karma had not just hit back, it had reshaped the entire landscape, leaving ruin for those who had abused their power and offering a new beginning for the one person who had tried to do the right thing. While the world feasted on the drama, Julian Sinclair was silent. He issued no personal statement. He gave no interviews. He didn't gloat or take a victory lap. To do so would have been to reduce a profound moment of corporate reckoning to a simple act of personal revenge. And Julian's vision was far grander than that. He had spent the afternoon not watching the news, but in a series of intense back-to-back video conferences from a rented office in Manhattan. With him were Sir Gideon Drake and the shell-shocked executive board of Stellara Global Holdings. The Zurich merger was temporarily on hold. A more pressing issue was at hand, the soul of his new company. The board members were deferential, terrified. They offered apologies, excuses, and promises to make things right. They expected him to rage, to demand heads roll. Julian listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When they had finished their panicked apologies, he finally spoke, his voice cutting through the corporate babble with surgical precision. "Gentlemen," he began, "what happened today was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. A symptom of a corporate culture that has prioritized the illusion of luxury over the substance of respect. A culture that has taught its employees to assess a person's worth by the color of their skin or the perceived size of their wallet rather than the simple fact of their humanity." He paused, letting the words sink in. Brenda Walsh and Richard Thorne were not bad apples. They were the products of a rotten orchard. Firing them was not the solution. It was a necessary amputation to stop the spread of a disease. But the disease remains. Our task is not to punish. It is to heal, to rebuild. Over the next several hours, Julian laid out his vision. It was not a PR strategy. It was a revolution. First, he announced the immediate and permanent dissolution of the Diamond Medallion Premier Guest Program and all similar tiered preferential systems. "Our service will be exemplary for every single passenger, from seat 42F to 1A, he declared. "A ticket is a contract for safe passage and respectful service. It is not a license for superiority. From now on, at Stellara Air, respect is not an upgrade. It is the standard." Second, he outlined the creation of the Office of Inclusivity and Service Excellence. This would not be a token HR department. It would be a powerful, independent body with direct oversight of all customer-facing operations. Its first director, he announced, would be Chloe, the junior flight attendant who had tried to intervene. We will build this new culture from the ground up, led by those who already possess the moral compass we wish to instill in everyone, he explained to the board's astonishment. Chloe would be given a team and a multi-million-dollar budget to create a new training regimen, developed in partnership with leading sociologists and ethics experts. Every single Stellara employee, from the baggage handlers to the CEO, would be required to complete it. Third, he addressed the passengers of cancelled Flight 815. Every passenger would receive a full refund, a travel voucher for 10 times the value of their original ticket, and a personal written apology signed by him. But he went further. He announced the creation of the Stellara Foundation, a charitable arm of the company to be seeded with an initial $100 million endowment. Its mission would be to fund educational scholarships and business grants for underrepresented communities. We will turn a moment of ugliness into a legacy of opportunity, he stated. Finally, he addressed the company's brand itself. Stellara Air, he explained, was tainted. In 6 months, the airline would be completely rebranded. A new name, a new livery, a new identity. This is not just cosmetic, he said. This is a declaration to the world that the old way of doing things is over. We will be a new airline, born from the ashes of this failure, dedicated to connecting the world, not dividing it. By the end of the meeting, the board members were silent, their fear replaced by a dawning sense of awe. They had witnessed the dismantling of their company's traditions, but they had also been given a blueprint for a stronger, more resilient, and more ethical future. They had come expecting a vengeful tyrant. They found an architect. The next day, Stellara Air released a formal, detailed press release outlining every single one of these points. It was penned not by a PR firm, but by Julian himself. It was a masterclass in corporate accountability. It didn't make excuses. It took ownership. It laid out a concrete, audacious plan for change. The public reaction was seismic. The narrative shifted overnight from corporate failure to radical reform. Business analysts who had predicted the airline's demise were now cautiously optimistic, hailing the moves as bold and revolutionary. The story was no longer about a fired crew. It was about a CEO who was willing to tear down his own house to rebuild it on a foundation of integrity. Julian Sinclair had proven that true power wasn't in the ability to fire someone. It was in the ability to inspire, to rebuild, and to change the rules of the game entirely. He had faced down ugly prejudice in a cramped airplane cabin and had responded by transforming a multi-billion-dollar global corporation into a beacon of the very principles he had been denied. The karma wasn't just hard, it was constructive. It hadn't just punished the guilty. It had empowered a new generation of thinking, turning a moment of personal humiliation into a global lesson in leadership. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Stellara Air was no more. In its place, a new airline was born, Equinox Airlines. The name was chosen by the employees themselves, symbolizing balance, fairness, and a new dawn. The livery was a simple, elegant design of deep indigo and silver, with a logo representing a stylized horizon, a promise of new beginnings. The first official flight of Equinox Airlines was, fittingly, Flight 815 from New York to Zurich. The media was out in full force, but the event was not a flashy affair. It was quiet, professional, and purposeful. Inside the redesigned A380, the changes were subtle but significant. The VIP first-class section was now simply called the International Business Suite. The gaudy walnut and chrome were replaced with sustainable materials and a more understated, modern aesthetic. The spirit of opulence had been replaced by a spirit of sophisticated comfort, accessible to all who purchased a ticket for that cabin. Standing near the boarding door, greeting each passenger with a warm, genuine smile, was Chloe. She was not serving champagne. She was the airline's new vice president of in-flight experience. In just half a year, she had gone from a nervous junior attendant to a confident executive, instrumental in designing the new service ethos of Equinox. Her training program, the Equinox Standard, was already being hailed as a new benchmark for the industry. The final passenger to board was Julian Sinclair. He wasn't in a suit this time, but in a comfortable cashmere sweater. He was heading to Zurich to finally sign the Helvetia Dynamics merger, a deal now even more valuable thanks to the positive press and strengthened brand identity of his aviation holding company. He carried his own bag and found his seat. He hadn't chosen 1A. He was in 3B, a regular suite. As he settled in, a flight attendant approached him, a young man with a kind face. "Mr. Sinclair," the attendant said, his voice respectful but not fawning, "welcome aboard. May I get you something to drink before we depart?" "Just some water would be perfect, thank you," Julian replied with a smile. He looked around the cabin. He saw passengers of all races and backgrounds treated with the same quiet, efficient respect by the new crew. He saw no special treatment, no fawning over perceived status. He saw the embodiment of the culture he had fought to create. He caught Chloe's eye from across the cabin. She gave him a small, proud nod. He returned it. No words were needed. As the plane pushed back from the gate, smooth and on time, Julian looked out the window at the sprawling expanse of the airport below. He thought of Brenda Walsh, who was reportedly now working as a dispatcher for a small trucking company in a different state. He thought of Captain Thorne, who had retired in disgrace, and of Alistair Finch, whose name was now a synonym for arrogant entitlement in legal circles. Their downfall had brought him no joy. It was a regrettable but necessary consequence of the change he needed to forge. His victory wasn't in their failure. It was here, in this quiet cabin at 30,000 feet. It was in the calm, respectful voice of the flight attendant, the confidence of the new VP he had empowered, and the simple, powerful idea that a person's dignity should never be up for negotiation. The plane ascended, breaking through the clouds into the brilliant, unending sunshine. Julian Sinclair, the man they had tried to cast out, leaned back in his seat. Not as an owner, not as a CEO, but simply as a passenger on a journey. He was flying on an airline that was finally worthy of its passengers, a phoenix risen from the ashes of prejudice, soaring into a brighter, more equitable sky. 18 months is a lifetime in the aviation industry. In that time, Equinox Airlines had gone from a PR crisis recovery to an unlikely trailblazer. Their on-time performance was impeccable. Their customer satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry. And contrary to the predictions of cynical rivals, they were profitable. The Equinox standard of universal respect had turned out to be a brilliant marketing and retention strategy. Passengers felt valued, and employees, empowered and respected themselves, provided unparalleled service. The revolution that began in Seat 1A was working. But for those swept away by the initial tidal wave of change, 18 months was a long, slow grind. David Shin used to walk the plush carpets of an A380 cabin. Now he walked the cracked, oil-stained tarmac of a regional airport in Chicago. He was one of the flight attendants from the original Stellara Air Flight 815. He hadn't been an antagonist like Brenda or a failed authority like Captain Thorne. He had been something far more common, a silent accomplice. He had stood in the galley, polishing wine glasses, and watched the entire drama unfold. He knew it was wrong. He saw the validity of Julian Sinclair's boarding pass. But Brenda was the purser, the undisputed queen of the cabin, and to challenge her was to invite her wrath. So David, like the others, had chosen the path of least resistance. He had kept his head down and his mouth shut. The price for his silence was his career. Being fired from the meltdown flight made him untouchable. No major airline would hire him. He was now a ramp agent for a third-party airport services company, loading baggage and directing aircraft with glowing orange batons in the freezing Chicago wind. A ghost haunting the industry that had cast him out. His position gave him a front-row seat to the airline he inadvertently helped create. He would often see the sleek, indigo-tailed Equinox jets pull into the gates. He watched their crews, a diverse and energetic group who moved with a different kind of confidence than the old Stellara crews. They smiled more. They helped each other. They treated the ground staff, people like him, with a respect he had rarely been afforded by flight crews in his past life. He watched them with a toxic cocktail of envy, resentment, and a deep, gnawing regret. One blustery Tuesday afternoon, an Equinox A321 bound for San Francisco had an issue with its ground power unit. The delay was indefinite, stranding the passengers on the plane. David's team was tasked with assisting. As he approached the aircraft, he saw a familiar face through the cockpit window, talking to the captain. It was Chloe. He'd heard she'd been promoted, but seeing her there in a sharp executive suit, commanding the situation with a calm authority he'd never seen in her before, was jarring. She was no longer the timid junior attendant. She was a leader. As the delay stretched on, a commotion began near the jet bridge entrance. A passenger, a wealthy-looking man in a designer tracksuit, was shouting at the gate agent. His connecting flight to Tokyo was now in jeopardy, and he was demanding Equinox charter him a private jet. It was a scene eerily reminiscent of a Leicester Finch. The same entitlement, the same arrogance, the same belief that his personal inconvenience trumped all else. The gate agent was trying to handle it by the book, the Equinox Standard Book offering apologies, solutions for rebooking, and meal vouchers. But the man was relentless, his voice getting louder, his gestures more aggressive. Other passengers were growing agitated. David stood by his baggage cart, watching. The old instinct, the one honed under Brenda Walsh's reign, screamed at him, "Don't get involved. It's not your problem. Keep your head down." But then he looked at the Equinox jet. He saw the new logo, the symbol of a new way. He thought of his own miserable situation, a direct result of that exact instinct to do nothing. He had stood by once while an injustice occurred, and it had cost him everything. Was he really going to do it again? Was this who he was forever? Something inside him snapped. He walked calmly over to the gate. He didn't address the irate passenger. He spoke to the flustered gate agent. "Excuse me," David said, his voice steady. "I'm with ground services. The captain has just been informed that the new GPU is 5 minutes out. We should be powered up and ready for pushback in 15. It was a slight exaggeration, the unit was on its way, but the timeline was optimistic. It was, however, a piece of information designed to de-escalate." He then turned to the angry passenger, not with confrontation, but with empathy. "Sir," he said calmly, "I used to be a flight attendant. I know how frustrating a missed connection is, especially one to Tokyo. But I can tell you that this crew will do everything in their power to get you rebooked on the best possible flight once you land. Their system is incredibly efficient. Yelling at the agent here won't change the mechanics of the plane." His calm demeanor, his insider knowledge, and the simple act of validating the man's frustration while gently redirecting him seemed to pierce the bubble of rage. The passenger, taken aback, sputtered for a moment, then seemed to deflate slightly. 15 minutes? Are you sure? That's the estimate, David said. It'll be faster for you to be on the plane, ready to go, than to be out here when they close the door. Just then, Chloe emerged from the jet bridge. Having been alerted to the commotion, she took in the scene, the calming passenger, the relieved gate agent, and the ramp worker in the high-vis vest who had stepped in. She looked at David, her brow furrowing in concentration. The face was older, weathered by wind and regret, but she recognized the eyes. "David," she said, her voice quiet with astonishment. "David Chen." David's heart sank. He expected anger, accusation, the dredging up of the past. He simply nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The angry passenger, having lost his audience and his momentum, grumbled and got back on the plane. The crisis was over. Chloe walked over to David, stopping a few feet away. "What are you doing here?" "Loading bags," he said, the words tasting like ash. "This is my job now." They stood in a pocket of silence amidst the airport's chaos. "I saw what you did," Chloe said. That was exactly what we train our people to do. De-escalate, inform, empathize." "I learned the hard way what happens when you don't," David admitted, finally looking at her. "Chloe, I'm sorry for that day. I knew it was wrong. I saw his boarding pass. I stood there and did nothing. I was a coward, and I've paid for it every day since. It was an apology 18 months in the making." Chloe listened, her expression unreadable. I know, she said softly. We were all put in an impossible position by Brenda. But the company, Julian, he had to make a clean break. The culture was so deeply ingrained. The only way to fix it was to remove it entirely, root and stem. It couldn't just be Brenda and the captain. It had to be a message to everyone, present and future. Complicity is not an option. Standing by is the same as pushing. She paused. It wasn't personal, David. It was structural. The simple explanation, devoid of malice, landed with more force than any reprimand. It wasn't about him as an individual sinner. It was about his role as a cog in a broken machine. Thank you, Chloe, he said, a weight he didn't even know he was carrying lifting from his shoulders. He didn't expect forgiveness or a job offer. The simple act of being understood was absolution enough. She gave him a small, sad smile. Keep doing what you just did, David. That's the man I thought you were. Be well. She turned and walked back to her plane, a leader returning to her duties. David watched her go, then turned back to his baggage cart. The wind was still cold, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel its bite. Later that week, Julian Sinclair sat in his office, which overlooked not the skyline of a major city, but the green, rolling hills of Aura Innovation's research campus. He was reading a report in an influential business journal. The article, titled The Equinox Effect, detailed how Equinox Airline's radical focus on employee empowerment and customer dignity had started a ripple effect across the industry. Other legacy carriers, once dismissive, were now scrambling to implement their own respect initiatives and simplify their labyrinthine loyalty programs. His bold experiment was not just a success, it was becoming the new standard. His computer chimed with a new email. It was a short, one-line message from Chloe. Subject, a win in Chicago. Body, you'll be proud of what happened today. The culture is holding. Julian smiled. He didn't need to know the details. He knew that the single bravest decision he had ever made was not to fire an entire flight crew. It was to trust in the fundamental decency of people like Chloe and to build a system that nurtured and protected that decency. The story of Flight 815 was never truly about a seat, a plane, or a billionaire's revenge. It was about the moment a line was drawn, forcing everyone to choose a side. The ultimate karma wasn't the swift, satisfying downfall of the antagonists, but the slow, quiet, and arduous process of building something better in its place. It was in the transformation of a timid attendant into a confident leader. It was in the redemption of a man on a cold tarmac who finally found his voice by choosing empathy over apathy. True change, Julian knew, was not measured in stock prices or press releases. It was measured in the thousands of small, individual choices made every single day, long after the cameras have gone. Choices that prove that integrity is not just a moral virtue, but the only currency with any real, lasting value. This wasn't just a story about revenge. It was about a revolution in values, proving that true power isn't about privilege, but principle. Julian Sinclair could have just demanded an apology, but instead he chose to dismantle the entire system that made such an insult possible. He showed that the ultimate karma isn't just seeing the guilty punished, but using a moment of darkness to build a better, brighter world for everyone. This story is a testament to the fact that integrity, when wielded with intelligence and vision, is the most powerful force for change. If this story of justice and transformation resonated with you, please hit the like button to let us know, Dark Stories fans. Share it with someone who needs to see that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, can have world-changing consequences. And most importantly, subscribe to Dark Stories for more real-life dramas where karma delivers the final, unforgettable verdict.